All right, this is the 10th episode of Writer's Block. We got a normal guest, Thorin. I was going to say special guest, but, I don't want to put him on the spot. Thorin, we've been on your talk shows before. I think I did Counterpoints. Max did 2. Sam did, of course, 0, but he did a different show. Sam is probably, obviously, your favorite Canadian philosopher there is. But Thorin, I got a question for you to start. I was sort of thinking about the show. We've all interacted with you in the past. You've sort of been very nice to us by letting us come on your shows. When you saw this podcast come up in the works, were you thinking like, "Oh, good for them! Like this is great that they're have their own little club," or were you? I don't really think there's a middle ground. Or were you furious that 9 episodes in you hadn't gotten that invite yet?
Not really, because I'd say the two points are kind of connected. Like, first of all, Snoochie already tried doing a show where it was him and other people who get invited on shows, and that also died on its ass. So I was just figured, let it run its course, probably just a phase, maybe moved on and grow up.
Yeah, well, not yet. We have not grown up yet. So the topic for this week is going to be sort of the international team thing that's going on. We have 3 teams that have been... So
basically, actually, I'll summarize that with I'll give you a visual metaphor, okay? I'm like the conservative father, businessman, stocks in the, public index, everything, and then you come home from university, you're in your first year, and you say, "Father, I've become a lesbian." And what I do is I look over the paper, I lift up my glasses and just go, "Very well, dear," and then I just go back to it, and I just trust that it'll take care of itself. There you go.
All right, Thorin, you gave me some pretty good advice behind the scenes. One time you were like, "Don't let your guests interrupt so much." Back to the topic.
You failed, so.
Back to the topic. Well, I was already halfway through the introduction of the topic. But yeah, MIBR, North, and Big all sort of going through this thing where they're all sort of switching it up in terms of going from a national team to an international team. Big picking up Smooya, MIBR having a horrible branding exercise with picking up 2 North American players, and then North actually picking up Mixwell, and I don't know if he's a permanent member or not. But maybe the first place to start would be Big, because I think it's sort of strange, like they sort of came out of nowhere. I don't think they really had any results. I think they were at DreamHack Summer and didn't do anything, didn't get out of groups, lost to Liquid twice, or no, that was the Brazilian ESL event, I think.
Yeah.
But they sort of came out of nowhere and got the 2nd place at ESL 1 Cologne. I mean, Sam, you're the op expert, the op connoisseur here. What do you like? Does this seem like? I don't know. Did it seem like the perfect match for Big to have this guy on this team? Because he seemed like a playmaker, someone who's having good numbers, maybe not a superstar, but did you think, maybe just talking about Big specifically, what did you think of this new lineup in comparison to that old Big that we saw maybe at the old, like back when Big briefly had their good tournament way back a year ago last summer at the major?
I don't think Smooya is that good. I don't think he fits amazingly well into this roster. I mean, I think he was fine at this event. He had some very good moments. It's weird because he doesn't actually fit very well with the roster composition at all. Like, this is a team that's quite conservative generally, and he's very far from conservative even in this team. He's gun picked off quite a lot, running away from bomb sites and just trying to get some frags at the end of rounds. And I mean, he was pretty good at this event. He was fine, but I don't think that's the reason that they were particularly good. I think the biggest reason for why they were so successful was the fact that Tapson was a very good player again, and Nex, out of nowhere, was suddenly good at an international event, which was very nice to see. And those 2 people carried them very strongly in terms of firepower. And then the strategic, horse that is God B did them wonders against teams that were playing very sloppy, especially FaZe and MIBR. But I don't think that, when I watched it, I didn't think that Smooya was pivotal, and neither was the other player. I forget, his name escapes me, but they both had good individual moments, but I didn't think that they were the linchpin or the thing that recreated Big's identity. No.
Max, what do you think? How much of this big team did you watch? Did you have any specific ideas of why they succeeded?
Because Big's always that team where I never watch specifically, but when I watch back like over VODs, they are like the team that's against the team I want to watch. Sometimes when I'm watching lower tier European competition. So I've sort of like incidentally got a lot of background context for how Big plays. And what surprised me a lot watching their games was definitely like Tabson and Nex going huge. And I think Tabson is one of the most underrated tier 2 European superstar type players. Like he's very consistently huge for Big's win conditions into a round. But I was also seeing like Godby and Pitt. I don't know how many big Inferno games you guys watch, but like Godby and Pitt is insane. And he had some big individual moments, as well as like Tizian becoming more serviceable throughout the tournament, it felt like. And I don't know, I wouldn't expected sort of Godby or Tizian to be able to hold their own on such a big stage like Cologne. And maybe I can like see a world where that happens to Tabson, Nex, or Smooya more so. But I was like pretty impressed with how cohesive Big were, even in spite of maybe some of the weaker individual components.
So I actually sort of had a different take. I was thinking, going back to the old Big, what they really lacked was, of course, firepower with like Godby in combination with Legija. I saw on a VOD Legija struggling to open a plastic bag, and I thought that was a pretty good metaphor for his CSO career. But I thought what Smooya added was like this interesting flair where he's like a very like brash, aggressive AWPer, sort of like a Mertz, but maybe a bit more successful. Well, we could talk about Mertz later, but like it sort of goes into this theme of the international team where it seemed like they added this piece that I thought was interesting, and what they lacked, they didn't seem to have a playmaker. Tabson's sort of a good, strong player, but he's sort of like, it feels like an Adren to me, where he's put in very aggressive entry positions, not so much a playmaking player like a Fur. Thorin, did you have a different take? Do you think that the Smooya edition was more beneficial than maybe Sam and Max are giving credit for, or are you sort of not even that big on Big?
The thing that I think about their team is, like, I actually still don't think it's that good a lineup, even when you look at it now. Yeah. Like, even when you take into account people overperforming, it's not really that sick, some of the stuff they did. So, in fact, actually, they're one of those teams where if you have a look at it, it's no surprise they crept through so many 3-map series, because how do you get to the final of a tournament and have almost no one have like killer stats in the lineup? How does that even happen in one of these formats? We've seen how it happens when like QB Fire did it at the major. It probably means that you won by the bare minimum. You had a really nice performance on a couple of people. It probably doesn't happen again. So in terms of the team dynamic, I don't really know which way to go, because obviously all the last times I've seen this lineup playing, it wasn't very good. So I didn't really take too many conclusions from that, just ignored it and thought they were a bad team. So, like, if I had to guess, I think adding Smooya seems pretty useful, because I think unless you are like the best team in the world, I don't think it really makes sense to have everyone have like the same style in your team. Like, you need a little bit of variety. For me, it's more about like balance within the overall style. Like, some people can play a counter style even, as long as it's integrated within the concept that the rest of us don't. So I think in that sense, they've kind of carved a niche for him. Like, I definitely don't think he's doing stuff that they told him to do. I think they just kind of let him play how he wants at the moment, and they're figuring it around him. So that's actually the one area where I wonder, because I would go ahead, obviously, and assume this team has a whole bunch of tournaments now that are way worse placings than this. And that's when the question mark is, do they still think? Because if you look at all interviews where they speak about Smooya, they act as though he's like a diamond in the rough, and they're going to like polish him off and figure him out. Well, if that happens, he might just end up being a very average AWPer, because I think actually probably the strength of his AWPing is being super unpredictable, taking all these peaks that no one should take who's a rookie player.
Yeah. Sam, what do you think about this? Do you think this overarching theme, though? Do you think that like a more unpredictable sort of element within the team is going to help a team like Big? Do you think that the international flair, being able to grab someone that's maybe not super polished, maybe doesn't fit into the system, but is it sort of, to Thorin's point, like a different sort of player, actually add something to Big? Or do you think this is sort of like a one-off, or you sort of more cautious about the idea that this is going to be a successful strategy using this sort of player?
But the thing is, I don't think that they had much success at all in, let's say, their biggest best of 3 one, which was against FaZe. I don't think they had much success at all with Smooya. I don't think he was very good. in a few of those maps, especially Dust 2. Like he was playing against Guardian, but like Guardian was having an off series and he was still out opping Smouya. Smouya seemed to have trouble with timings. He seemed to be getting caught on timings quite a bit, not have a good feel for when players were going to peek him or enter into his crosshair. I thought maybe he'll get used to that. Obviously, he hasn't played a ton of international lands, but he just felt like he was quite uncomfortable. And I don't think that much of their success came up from Smouya openings. There were definitely some, like on Inferno against MIBR, he had a couple rounds where he was really flashy, but I don't think that they benefited that much from his opping. So
well, what do you think about like stylistically? Like, do you think this is like a good stylistic fit for the team, rather than just like is he good or bad? Do you think that like just in terms of the idea of having a mix of players, like maybe this is a better way, more interesting way for you to answer. Like, what opera would fit in big better than him? And don't just say like the best opera.
Edge of my seat right now.
No, this is interesting. I used to say, before North added Mertz, I used to say that they needed someone who was much more dynamic than Cajun B, and that's definitely true. I stand by that opinion, but what I realized is that if you have someone dynamic, it's a big problem in later round situations if they're constantly pushing aggressively and not on the same page as their teammates. And so while they might bring something in the opening, even if they're relatively consistent at getting opening kills, it can be a big problem if they make decisions in a different way than the rest of their team. And what made me realize that, which we might talk about later, was Stewie 2K in MIBR, which was, I think, the biggest example right now of someone who's not on the same page as his team. And so, like, it can be a boon, but you have to make sure that that player understands or has changes his reflexive response when the situation demands it. He has to be able to flip a switch and just, I'm not supposed to push the smoke right now. I need to not do that. And it's quite difficult for players like Mertz or like Stewie or maybe like Smouya to do that. And so it has its pros and cons. Ideally, you want a player who's able to switch his style and play both aggressively and passively. There are operas like that are young right now, but it's a very tough balance. And so it's difficult to say. On the balance, it could be better for Big Def Smouya than, say, the previous opera, but
Max. It was
Keeve, I think.
Keeve.
But
Max, my bad.
But it wouldn't be better than, say, having someone who's relatively passive but much more consistent, much more in line with what they're doing. Someone like Yugi, who's not like that much better than Smouya generally, but his style is much more versatile, and that fits better, I think, with Big's game plan.
Yeah, it's also worth saying that like Keeve wasn't exactly a Cajun B type AWPer, like he could very easily play aggressively, I thought, in the sort of contextualizing games I watched. But it was obviously and I think that's all the parallels you drew there. I think it's important that like they were added into a system already. You know what I mean? If you think like Mertz to North, like Stewie 2K to MIBR, whereas when you look at someone like Nifty for Renegades, it's like even though he has that super like late round, potentially round destroying like mistakes in his game, it doesn't feel like he's as apart from Renegades as someone like Smouya is from Big. Maybe because he obviously has the leadership and like can create a system more around himself. And then you also look at someone like Chris J for Mouse, even though it's that same sort of like weird stylistic dissonance where he's like too aggressive at times, he still feels really a part of Mouse, which is obviously costing them games now, but it's besides the point.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, the thing with Big is, I mean, there's a difference between if you're Denmark and you're recruiting within Denmark, or if you're within France and you're recruiting within France and French-speaking Belgium, versus like Germany, where it doesn't. There's what? How many good operas to the level of a top opera of a Yugi are there, right? So it almost seems necessary, and it goes to a sort of paradigm shift we're seeing in the scene where it seems like there's just no, unless you're in one of these elite scenes, Sweden, France, maybe North America, maybe Denmark, definitely. It seems like there's no point in keeping these like strict national lineups together. I mean, like Thorin, what do you think about this idea that? I mean, you sort of suggested that it was a positive that there was a diversity of player, but maybe you sort of have a long history in the game. What do you think about the actual, like, how big do you think the negative is of the language change, right? Because this is sort of something that's going to come up when we switch to MIBR, and maybe this is a good point here, because switching from a native language to to all English language could, I mean, this is sort of this, it's sort of this nebulous point. I don't know if you have any sort of insight into this, like just talking about going away from simply the style of player.
I mean, it's certainly rich that everyone's discovered now that everyone's beloved SK Gaming's not winning anymore. That turns out speaking in a second language is pretty hard. 'Cause it's weird that Fierce Clan team was doing that every single match, even in all those finals that they won. Wow. Seems like they're a better team than everyone sort of put their money down for. But okay, just a side point, one of those things people notice. I guess you got to grow. It takes time. So I would probably say the big differentiation for me between when someone like the current Mouse Sports team does it and when MIBR does it is, like, first of all, you can never truly get a bead for people like Brazilian speaking Portuguese exactly how good their English is. So, for example, people keep saying to this day that, like, Bolts doesn't speak any English. I mean, I've spoken to him personally in real life, so don't know what language I was reading, if he had some sort of Star Trek universal telecoder or something, but didn't seem like he did. Seemed like he was just struggling and it was a second language. So for me, it's more along the lines of, like, is there an in-game leader that has to communicate some sort of vital concept during games? Like, is someone creating the system? Are they just giving you a role within it and they lay that out? Because you can see how one scenario would make language barriers, cultural barriers almost impossible, and the other would mean it would just a little bit more difficult. It depends how much work you put in, how good your players are. So I think it's no coincidence most of the really good teams of the international lineups are all just play off your own skill pretty much lineups, and it's like everyone within the team. You notice no one's really constructing these teams. They just put the team together, and if it works, you keep that lineup because those players happen to be able to play together. If it doesn't work, you just move on and get a new player. In fact, if anything, those are going to be the quickest lineups to get someone in and out. So I'm actually surprised that a team like Big's doing it, because you would think they're going for a tactical approach. They're going for something very in-depth. And again, they've only had one tournament so far, so I mean, we can't really know. They've had the bad times, they've had the good, so I'm not really sure that that's any kind of outlier in that sense.
Okay. Well, it's interesting with Smooya specifically, with that sort of that language thing does work with him. Well, I guess that they're good. I mean, like, it seems like, okay, if there's this issue of not being able to translate difficult concepts to him, that's fine because he's a pretty independent player, and it really and sort of that issue is dependent on actually the player, not and his role on the team, right? But then we sort of get to this interesting situation with MIBR where, yeah, it's sort of a hard situation with Stewie 2K. Now they're going to add Tarik, where with the English. Sam, you had a point about MIBR and Stewie 2K's role in it and how you think he's not fitting in. Could you elaborate on that point? Maybe we're going to get into this topic via the point that you already want to get out.
Yeah, I actually thought, like, I wrote an article when the move was first announced. I thought it was going to be good, and I was entirely wrong. But I thought that Stewie 2K has a really good game sense, and so I thought that it was probable.
It used to seem like that, didn't it?
Well, it was probable to me that though he was an aggressive player, it would make sense that since he understands when to go in, when not to go in, he would be able to change his reflexive response to pressure by, retreating instead of going forward. But that has definitely not happened. He has not done that. And he seems constantly super awkward in retake situations. Like he's pushing when someone else is backing off. He's pushing a smoke. He's getting headshot in the back. It's just, and I don't know, a lot of people are attributing that to communication. I don't know if that's communication or it's just, different players understanding the game differently. But that's a perfect example of a team or like 4 players and one other player that seem to understand the game in completely different ways. So I think, like, it's impossible for me. I have never listened to their comms, so I can't tell if it's a communication thing and if, they're just not able to speak English properly or very quickly. But it's definitely clear that there's something off about that roster, which is why it's weird that they're kind of doubling down on keeping Stewie and going even more English instead of, picking up a player that's, speaks the language and that they think will be a stylistic match. But
I mean, a cynical man would say they've sort of overspent on something that cannot be sold at retail value, and therefore they have to go that way because it's actually cheaper to get another American player than to pay a massive buyout for some dog shit Brazilian we don't know. Sadly, that's just an example of where the industry ruined the sports.
No, that's a good point. But yeah, the point being, there's definitely a very strong lack of cohesion in that team, specifically between Stewie and the rest of the team. That's like, it's quite overt and it's strange to see, but every single time that Stewie's on a site with someone else, it feels awkward. Or when he's doing a retake with someone else, it feels awkward, even if he has good individual plays. And statistically, he's doing fine. Yeah.
Max, what do you think about this? It's sort of hard for me to put my finger down on. I haven't watched a ton of MIBR of why they sort of haven't been able to figure out their map pool and like why that team isn't. Do you have a theory? Is it Stewie 2K related, or is it something different? Like we can blame the Stewie 2K move, but they were falling apart like before that whole situation arose. What is there a general thing that you point to in your mind when you think?
I definitely agree with you that I think the sort of collapse of this call was happening before Stewie 2K joined the roster, and I think there's a very strange dynamic not just going on, but like I definitely agree with what Sam's point, the sort of weird relationship between Stewie 2K and the roster, but I also think internally there's this really strange tension of leadership and how Fallen calls the team and integrates himself into the team as well. And we saw that at around IEM Sydney. And we saw, like, as this sort of structural changes happened with Stewie 2K being brought into the roster and having to integrate this new sort of thing that makes you change your calling language as well, Fallen sort of come out of place with how to call the roster, and like Cold Zero was the secondary RGL for a bit, and it seems to be this really weird entirely structural shift as well as this internal shift between like the language as well. And they play these like such weirdly late round, I don't know if you've seen them, but where they just run out of time so often, where they just play so slow that they look so rigid. And then it's especially when you contrast to that to the strengths and how you normally think of this core playing, which is, you know, this really loose and fast style and being able to take over any 2vx scenario with really an intuitive sense of how to play and how to like feel the flow for the game, to then see players like Fur and Bolts like lost in late round scenarios and being stalled out for time. Yeah, it's really, really weird. And I think that can definitely be attributed in part to Stewie 2K joining, but also to like a systematic sort of decline before the move as well.
Well, it's weird with that because I think way back at episode 2 we talked about that. It's sort of like this weird paralysis by analysis thing where they seem to be too caught up in how to win and stop just doing sort of their natural progression, their natural play style, and they sort of had this weird shift in that Stewie 2K move only seemed to worsen that progression rather than shift them back to sort of their winning style. But Thorin, I know the theme of this episode is talking about this international infusion sort of thing going on, but I mean, what would you put on the MIBR SK thing? Because this has been going on for a while. I mean, I think you talked about the whole phase thing because you had that article with the world rankings that all the SK fans got super mad at, right? Where they're mad at you.
They don't have a great understanding of arithmetic. That's
yeah. But
like they couldn't understand how, you know, like 8 top 4s is better than 3 or whatever it was. Yeah. So it's one of those bizarre things, isn't it?
Yeah, but then like there's that weird thing with the major and the roster moves, and they never seem to come back from that. I mean, is there something broader here, or is it the Stewie 2K thing in more in your mind?
If you want to set up like the sort of broad strokes, I would say first of all, there's actually a point I think I made in the video when I talked about Stewie 2K joining the team. It's like the reason why I thought it was not a good move is, first of all, stylistically, I didn't see how he fit with the team at all, and they clearly haven't tried to build the team around him, because why would you? And one of the reasons why is it's basically like just saying, let's get Volps back again, but unable to speak our language. Brilliant. Yeah. You know, I thought Volps was pretty good in that team. Every time everyone banged on him, like, oh, what an idiot. Oh, look at all the mistakes he's making. Well, you soon saw all those mistakes without him as well, didn't you? So it's very rich to just blame one player in that scenario. It's almost like people don't understand the concepts of map pressure, exactly where opponents will identify your weaknesses, etc. So for me, the biggest problems with their team is like, yeah, they didn't. It's a classic example of when people win, they often make that like mistake of like a survivorship bias on every factor that goes into their team. So a lot of them actually think that they win for reasons that you would never even put top 5 as sort of like factors about their team, or if you did a scouting report on them, you'd never mention this aspect. And so if you think about it, they were never a team that used to just blow everyone out of the server anyway, when they were at their best. You have to go years back to find any really dominant pictures of that. So they were already a team that had actually made its living, a la the Virtus Pros of the world, on being like, oh, we stay in a game and we win these close games at the round, and we maybe win when the psychological components. So the problem with all that is you have to get yourself into that situation before you can even apply that. It's the same reason why Astralis has just been winning every tournament, but the entire time has had the same obvious character flaw that they had their entire history, but no one could ever put them in a position to actually expose the character flaws. It was irrelevant. If they just front run all day long, no one can ever make them feel the pressure. So to me, the SK team absolutely missed all these factors, like that they're communication based, that you have to understand their system and what your role within the system is, that you have a mixture of styles, and that's what makes up each of your good maps. Like, one of the things I always thought was really misunderstood by analysts about their team last year was that people did that classic thing where the win rate on paper says like 70%, and they go, stamp of approval, you are a good team on this map. Whereas actually, if you have good enough players and you're a good enough team, you can win 70% on a map that actually fundamentally you don't have a great read on how to play, and you don't even necessarily innovate anything on. So for me, I thought they did that on maps like Train, like AWPers. They were good teams because they had a good player at the one spot, or they just happen to have mad firepower. But I think what happens is when people lose some of the raw firepower, you see kind of their weaknesses exposed even more. And so, yeah, it's not that crazy that the map pool shrunk to me.
Yeah. Wait, can I just jump in? I actually think I remember one of the things that was first noticed is actually from you, Thorin, and way back in 2015 when they started getting some results, was the thing that people noted about them was that they were really good at closing out rounds. But and that's part of their poise and part of their communication and all that, and what became their famous trait for the years afterwards. But now they're really good at getting opening kills, but they cannot convert on late round situations at all. It's like the antithesis of what they were before. So it's like they've given up their entire identity. So for example,
which is hilarious if you think about it, because obviously people would imagine that's like some innate skill that you just know what to do. I mean, some people would even go, I think people went too far when they took like my analogy that Fallen had taught these guys how to play, as though he literally taught them like, flow chart of you always do this. No, because that would obviously first of all, anyone could copy that pretty easy. And then secondly, like, no, obviously you have to refine this as you go on.
Yeah, but like, for example, in the big match that they lost 22-20, and they had 35 opening kills in the so they had these out of like 45 rounds. So they should have absolutely won way more rounds than they ended up winning. And against big, like, should be able to close out rounds against big. But a lot of the players don't seem to be on the same page. And part of that is because those players that seem to be very strong in late round situations are gone. Like FNX is gone. He was one of the top ones in the old days, and now Taco's gone. And so now two of the players that were very, very good and fundamentally sound have been replaced. And so it makes sense to me that like they slowly picked away at one of their strengths, and now they've tried to get more firepower, and that has not, even though it's converted in terms of opening round effectiveness, they are better now in opening rounds. They're way worse at a lot of other things because of the moves they've made.
Well, it's weird. It's like they seem to be, going in that stylistic shift, because now you sort of see more of the Cloud9 coming in, another sort of entry player, aggressive player, and Tarik coming in. I mean, that was sort of Cloud9's thing. Those executes on Mirages are what we all remember from the major, right? From the E-League Boston. Max, is this sort of flowing with you? Do you think it's sort of like a transition towards a more FaZe Cloud9 sort of roster, and that's sort of a fundamental misunderstanding of their strengths? Or, I mean, is it more about sort of this fundamental issue of like the international team of the communication? Or like, what do you, maybe a better way of framing this is like, what do you think about the roles in SK or MIBR now? Do you think they work? What do you think of Stewie 2K or like the Tarik move and that sort of thing?
I think it's pretty hard to draw like a really big grand narrative with a team, just because I think a lot of what teams do isn't just internal, but like in response to the pressures at the time. And I think when you make a move like bringing in firepower like Stewie 2K, you also have to look at the teams the Brazilians are trying to beat at that time as well. And yeah, I'm definitely not researched enough to like say anything along those lines. But I think in terms of the roles right now, yeah, it's really, really tough because you see a team like Mouse Sports fall flat and do a lot of what MIBR try to do within a round as well. And it's really disconcerting that like teams that play this way just don't last unless you have just this crazy momentum of individual skill backing you along the way, and you have the benefit of not having like elite structured teams to punish you for playing a looser style. And so when I see these 2-2K and like Tarik, I think, yeah, that's also a really interesting move as well. Obviously brings like an open presence to the matchups as well. I think it's a lot of those slower structured rounds that die out as well is also like a swinging motion, like in response to maybe getting like picked too often or not being able to convert opening kills. They feel like a need to play super structured because they know they're losing rounds they shouldn't be. And I think that for sure the roles right now don't work with that like reactionary shift back to a more structured style, because I don't think you can play that brand of CS with the talent that MIBR currently have right now. You have to remember Fallen isn't exactly playing too well either, and he's like a big key to their late round success historically.
Yeah, I actually think on the CT side, the Tarik move works quite well. I'm surprised that they did it, because originally it was rumored that they would get Tim, but on C9, on at least the old C9, Tarik was their anchor player, their small site anchor player on a lot of bomb sites. And so that's definitely going to be useful, because obviously they removed Taco, and no one's really fit naturally into that position since then. So that will probably help them on a few maps. But on the T side, it's very strange, because now they remove one of their more passive players with a player that was very aggressive on the T side. And so it seems like they're going to have to, again, radically change the way that they play their T side and like remove Fallen even more from their T side than they already have. And like Fallen has been the least involved he's ever been in a match. Like his stats are, he's like he's got like a 0.62 kills per round and a 0.64 deaths per round. Like he's never involved in the map.
It's weird how that works, isn't it? Because you pop someone like it, let's say Kenny S, is simple. You chuck these AWPers in any team in the world, any game, chuck them in your FPL game now, they'll just take over, start shooting people in the face with that gun called the AWP. But some players, hailed as greatest AWPer in the world, can't make it work no matter what goes on. It's weird how that works, isn't it? All the mysteries of life.
Well, I actually think so. So Fallen is definitely degraded in terms he's playing less well than he has, but I also think that he's made a conscious decision to play less aggressively, to let other players. And I think that's the biggest reason his stats are going down. Now, I think that's a shame, and that's very strange, because I don't think that Fallen as like a supportive force is particularly strong. It's a weird place to put him, and he hasn't been particularly bad, but he's not been very good either. And it's a sort of shame, because you're taking the best part, or one of the key factors in their success was Fallen's aggressive opping style and his ability to find opening picks, and that's like completely gone. Like he hasn't done that in over like 6 months. So that's even. But the point I'm making is that with Tarik, it seems like you're stretching Fallen even more, and he's opping less and less. Like on Inferno, he like 3 people ops, 2E2K ops, Cold Zero ops, and Fallen ops, because if they want to op on the A bomb site, they're going to make cold op, because no one can play B except for Fallen. So like it's a massive problem right now, and that's going to their T side especially is going to be even more strange and not non-cohesive because of the Tarik move.
Well, I saw Pimp on Twitter today praise Lucas, the brother of Hen One, I guess that's how you say it, or Henny. Then no one says Lucasy, right? But anyway, yeah, you forget about this guy, but he was, I think, Max's interview with Fallen, where way back at Sydney 2017, where he said he wanted Lucas in the team, but there's sort of between Lucas and Phelps, and they went with Phelps. It seems like it seems very bizarre that, I mean, Thorin sort of alluded to the buyout situation, but it seems like Lucas or a player, I mean, you have to go back to FNX or someone like this, maybe, and maybe they don't want to do that because of personality reasons, would be a much better fit for that team right now if you want to replace a Bolts, right? Or if you want to replace Taco.
Yeah.
It seems strange that they would try to make this shift, and it seems like there's this weird devaluation of support players generally. I sort of made this point on the last episode. In international teams, in these international mixes, with players like Sticko not staying in Mouse Sports, and you see Taco leaving, right? It seems like small side anchors and support players are sort of not what's in vogue right now. I mean, Max, what do you think about this idea? Like, what do you think about a Lucas on an SK instead of a Tarik or a Stewie 2K? Would that be a strong move to you?
Yeah, no, for sure. I definitely think, especially if you wanted to change out a player like Taco, Lucas makes a lot of sense, because even though he was so aggressive on that Immortals roster historically, it felt like it was a very sort of structuring aggression, and that he was there for a very specific reason within a round, and that was like, this was the role you're playing. You're here to trade off of people. You're here to find and debate kills. I think it would make a lot of sense, and I feel like he would be the type of player to just do whatever job. Like, if he needed to become a small side anchor, he would, at least by watching how selflessly he plays in that team. I definitely would back a Lucas move, but obviously with the contracts are insane, then maybe not. And then with the point about like the devaluation of small side anchors, it's really interesting, because it always feels like a battle of superstars in the current climate, and teams just they're like in this weird arms race where they think they can solve problems through like names on paper, and and it's even tastier narrative when you see how well Liquid's doing with Taco as well in the ranks, at least relative to MIBR, I should say. But yeah, that's all I'd say on that.
Thorin, what do you think about this idea? The small, like, have you buying into this theory at all? I don't know if you saw last episode or not. I sort of mentioned this at one point, that it seems like Olaf Meister, Stiko, Taco, these sorts of guys are sort of not. It seems like a weird thing where it's almost like when you have that international market up, it seems like these players sort of get filtered out because of the amount of firepower available, but that there's not always these people to slot in. And then
if you knew how many pro players are literally just a HLTV.org forum poster, but with like 10 times better aim, it's not even a joke. Like, I've heard players who are in some of the best teams in the world who have an in-game leader who runs the whole thing and is like massively integral, and then when they lose a big, we're going to kick that guy. He's not very good. He doesn't know what he's doing. Look at the rest of us. We were all fragging out. What was he doing? It's like, but you definitely got yourself into all those positions. So you wouldn't believe how, to me, it's just the natural hierarchy in a team. Like, sadly, you take that truism that like a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and these morons think that actually means that you look for the weakest link and just remove it repeatedly, where that's not really the point of it. It's actually a metaphor about how you if that position is strong relative to the rest of the thing, then you're in a good spot. So like, I think, first of all, as a team like Mouse Sports is the best example, because this is literally an example of a bunch of young players who've never had proper success before, tested the international market. And the whole point is, these international teams generally are actually either they're just players who come from countries where they could never have a team, in which case it is overwhelmingly going to be a good thing that they're in an international team, or they either actually tend to fail. I have to say, most of those lineups will just look past the ones that don't work. It's just that when you have an unlimited market of people you can bring in your team by going to the English language, you can very quickly replace those players that don't work initially anyway. So when you're stuck in your national scene, that's why every single discussion about moving a player from the same country is about politics. It's not even about should the player fit his squad. Same with this MIBR discussion you're just having now. No one at any point in MIBR could make a shortlist and go, these are the 4 players who play this sort of role. Can we get them? Because they already knew most of them were precluded by buyouts, or we can't have them in the team because of social reasons. And so you end up in this mad scenario where I think they're almost forced to go the route of a lot of the international teams and just look for the best player, and then after the fact try and see if he fits into your squad. So it's actually one of the flaws with how people recruit in Counter-Strike, unfortunately, I think.
Yeah, I try to like defer and say, the players know best, but like even the most improved team recently is Liquid, and they added Taco. They didn't remove him, and so it's very strange to me that like Mouse has kicked Sticko because, and actually the reason that Mouse kicked Sticko is because they, and I quote, weren't going to settle for making playoffs anymore.
They were right. I believe them.
But the thing is, like now, not only are they way more at risk of not making playoffs at all, but also it's not clear that their core can actually carry them to winning a bunch of tournaments. It doesn't seem like Stico was the problem there. It just feels like they were about where you would expect them to be based on the caliber of their players, and that's great. And it's good to be ambitious, I guess, but it doesn't seem like removing Stico and adding Snacks would be the natural transition to improve your team. So I don't know. I feel like the teams are trying to chip at the edges and improve their teams, by trying to compete through a depth of skill, and because they can't match superstars like Simple, or they can't be as good as Astralis, generally speaking. So, and they can't match FaZe either. So they're just trying to make let's try our best to get as much skill as possible, and maybe it'll work. But the thing is, when you're doing that, you're making your middle ground, or let's say your floor way lower as a team. And so you see a lot of teams like MIBR or Mouse just getting worse over time, and it's pretty depressing to see. So, which is, I think, this is the big reason, I think, why we're seeing so many teams be like, overall, the top 10 is much worse than it was previously, even though Astralis is a very good top 1 team. It's because of this like sort of devaluation of team play and just trying to accentuate or exaggerate individual skill.
Max, how does it fit into your theory earlier? You were saying that like teams make roster moves in response to who's the best team in the world. I think Moses last week or 2 weeks ago was saying that like Astralis doesn't matter because there's so far ahead of everyone else that it's really a competition among everyone else. Do you think that's sort of the situation why teams are going more and more international, not sort of trying to go the Astralis route and like trying to? I mean, is Astralis just a special team that no one's going to try to emulate? What do you think about this sort of broad idea? Do you have any thoughts here?
I think it's easier. I'll back up a bit. So I think like in general, it's the reason why it's so frustrating to talk about this is that when you watch a team like ENCE or when Mouse Sports originally came together or when Hellraisers had their moment, and when you see these teams form based on looking at like they do what Thorin was saying before, like let's get a top 4 of these best players in this role and let's try to form a team that makes sense stylistically together. And that's what this Mouse Sports team and what Hellraisers and what ENCE all feel like on paper when you look at them and the way they approach a game. And so I think it's a lot easier to pick out individual stars and go through that process of forming a really cohesive ball, especially when you add in the difficulties of player politics and contracts, and then not actually knowing who fits on your team until you actually play in a server together. So you look at a team like Renegades, who I'm sure have been trying to do that for a long, long time to find those like 2 key pieces to fit in with them, and look how long it's taken them just to get sort of to reshift their model of picking players and how to evaluate the 3-man core altogether for them to find even like a tiny bit of success. And so I think it makes a lot of sense if you already have had that cohesion and had that team play like Mouse, to be like, why would we go through this entire process of forming another team play orientated team when we can just like swap out one component of it and keep swapping out one component until we find something that eventually works. So I think that's just going to be the unfortunate reality until like it eventually happens. Like eventually they realize they can't reignite that cohesion with the constant rotating fifth, and the core eventually recollapses and then has to build up from scratch again.
To be fair, I think that a lot of teams are trying to emulate Astralis. They're just doing it, like, let's say, in-house. Like, what makes Astralis much better than they were previously is not so much the way they built the roster, I don't think. Like, I don't think anyone's looking at them and say, oh, it's Zipnix. Yeah, that was the secret. Like, he's been around for, like, 3 years or 4 years on that roster. So I think teams are starting to use utility in a different way because of Astralis. You're seeing teams like Big and G2 really, really ramp up their utility use because of Astralis. And I think every team is eventually going to ramp up their utility use or change their mindset or approach to utility because of Astralis. And so, but that's the kind of thing that you can do in-house and that you should see progressively as players realize that they can't just, play the game and feel their way through it when you're playing against a team that's so good at predicting what you're going to do and punish it. So, but like, that's not quite fair, I don't think. Like that's, in terms of roster composition, I think people are much more looking at FaZe than like who's been amazing for a really long time now, for like a year and a half, and looking at them and saying like, how are they so consistent? And it's just like they're not doing that much special in game. Doesn't look like they're thinking particularly hard, although they do have some good strats. And they're trying to say, okay, let's just find our FaZe lineup. But the problem, like with Mouse Sports, the issue is that even though you can have Sonny, Robs, and Oscar and say, oh, these players are amazing, they're not quite as amazing as Ray, and they're not quite as amazing as Nico and Guardian. And so you're not going to beat FaZe consistently. And so you're just going to become like a mini FaZe. And now you're stuck, being another team, but a little worse. And I think that if there was a player that would, or if there were players that were available that were as good as Nico or Rain, they wouldn't be going to Mouse Sports. They wouldn't be going to Big. And so it's right. So I think that they're stuck in a trap where I think that Mouse Sports can't, or teams like Mouse Sports can't expect to do more than just make playoffs or get the occasional win. I think it's a miracle that this. Yeah, go ahead.
At least with the focus of the individuals, because that's why Astralis is so good as number one, is the fact that you can't play that like Chris J bullshit against Astralis and win games. You know what I mean? Like you can throw some Nico bullshit at Astralis and you can maybe get a couple maps, but you're not going to throw like players outside of that elite caliber in a loose fashion against them and consistently beat them in a best of 3.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, all right. Here's a Thorin-esque transition. Okay, in the book 1984 by Orwell, right? There's a character named Parsons, and he was sort of like the atypical like follower of Big Brother, like the most ardent supporter. But later in the book, he sort of rested because even in his dreams, he was saying "down with Big Brother." Now, if there's someone,
it's not like an SK fan at heart.
But if there's someone who I think would buck the trend to be the Wilson of the scene, it'd obviously be MSL. Like he's so against everything else everyone else in the world is saying. He seems to be fighting that thing, right? That trend, what everyone else seems to believe in, right? He's just this unorthodox character, but it seems like. It's more like it's like a Parsons. Like you're just disappointed when you learn about this MSL movie. He's not the person that you thought he was. He's actually just like everyone else. He's going with the Mixwell thing. He's in his sleep. He still can't get away from FaZe, right? The allure of that, and he's doing Mixwell for Merce. Thorn. Broad thoughts on our favorite character on the podcast on MSL. Do you think this is a mistake to try to go international?
I mean, first of all, if you look at the tournament they've done it at, it's just a DreamHack Open. It's not exactly like a massive tournament where everything hinges on it. They've also given no indication at all that he's any sort of like a long-term solution. Like you could this could literally be the scenario that like Mertz missed his flight and they were like, right, you missed 3 flights in a row. Mixwell wants to come to the tournament. He lives in fucking Spain. Oh, we're just going to use this guy. Like it could even be on that level, So I don't really know that they've like premeditated this and really thought it through. So like, I think the most bizarre part is that I don't really think that MSL's trying to do an international recruitment generally. I think it's like just so happens the guy is from Spain, is a free agent available, and they want to. If I would guess, they want to see what happens if you put a different AWPer in the team and just kind of get some feedback in that sense, get some information, because the downside of Mertz is, since in theory he was brought up through the North system, they imagine that he is well coached and they know how to use him. Remember, his current coach was his coach on the academy team. So there's really no reason for him to be failing in the main team. So I think it's more they don't really have any answers for what they're going to do with Mertz. So I don't think really they're going to go towards that. And it's also, I think, one of the funny things that when you have this topic about the international squads, because if you notice, aside from FaZe, which actually didn't know it, but they backdoored their way into getting probably the best in-game leader to have a mixed international roster with, every other team that's making these mixed international roster moves tends to be the ones that didn't have an amazing in-game leader. Like if you have an amazing in-game leader, whether you win or not, one of the things I like is they all have incredibly broad and strong, well-defined like stylistic strengths, because they have a whole philosophy they've built up over years and years that they're going to adhere to, and they're going to move parts around it, they're going to update it, but it's still going to be their team. Like, it doesn't matter what team Zeus plays on, they will always be Zeus teams, and as you see, they are very different when he leaves and every other player stays the same, and when he is the one person added, it completely transforms it. So the upside for an MSL team is I don't think they're going to go too far from the things that he does. I think it's just a little brief flirtation. I don't really know what they do in that team, because that's one of the aspects that I think kind of fucked the squad up, unfortunately. He's like bad team balance, but I don't mind trying something. They're not like a great squad.
Yeah, so actually, Ave put out a statement for North, and they cited Oscar is not meant to be a permanent member of the team. He actually did.
Oscar. I'm sorry, I'm not in first person. I call him by as a gamer tag.
No. We're tight with the DMs in this.
No. So he released a statement.
Sam just has a fixation on first names. I think Sam is probably the only person on Earth that's referred to me as my first name on Twitter. Like,
I might have actually called Lopez Tommy twice in my entire life, and I've known him about a decade.
Yeah, and I did it once, but I actually regretted that. I felt super awkward, but not the point. So Mixwell, he's there probably just because he's in Spain. What happened is they wanted to remove Mertz and put in a different opper, whoever that was, just to see what exactly is causing their poor CT sides. I tweeted like an hour ago that they had a 36.6% CT win rate at Cologne. They had a very bad win rate, and Mertz also was very bad at the tournament and bad at the prior tournament. So they decided that they couldn't find a consistent force on that CT side, and they're trying to figure out exactly why. They suspect that it's Mertz, and so they're trying something new, and they're going to reevaluate after a couple tournaments. Or maybe just one that wasn't clarified. They're going to try to figure out what the problem is and find a replacement or bring back Mertz. It's not clear yet. But the key point is that their CT sides were horror bad. They were very, very poor. And they're going to try to fix it by changing that opper situation. So that's basically why they removed him. So, but Mixwell isn't like meant to be the exact person there. He's not meant to be the main guy. But actually, I think if they want to keep Mixwell, it makes sense, I guess. I mean, actually, I'm not a big fan of Mixwell, but if you think about the kind of player he is very much a plug-and-play kind of player. And so if they're trying to figure out what's going wrong and if they're trying to plug holes and have someone a bit more consistent than Mertz, it makes sense. But, I mean, he's not going to be significantly better than Mertz at the same time. So I think it's a fine move in the midst, but I didn't get the feeling from the statement that they're just going balls deep and going to remove like AZ to get in, like Chris J or something like that. I don't think that's going to happen. So it's not clear yet if they're going fully international.
In many ways, Mixwell's the perfect addition to all international squads because he's never, ever been bad in any game ever, as far as I can tell from every analyst, every fan. Guy's just fucking amazing, So what's great is everyone should have a month of Mixwell and then move on with their life and actually grow the fuck up, I think. So... another detail, just as a small aside, this has nothing to do with anyone in this chat, but when I actually did one of those snipe events where we do like the couch thing and we're all sat there watching the game, there was, I think it was the Auckland one where NIP beat FaZe. I'm not certain. I think that was the one, because it was the one where we had Semler still. And during that, there's a clip that someone put on YouTube where, as part of the downtime, we had this argument. It was when we had Pimp with us as well. We had this argument where they all told me that like the AWP shouldn't be reverted from its nerf and that it's literally the most powerful gun in the game and how like, it's actually overpowered if anything. And I make all these points in the video that actually they are failing to understand a very basic principle, which is that if the only people at tier 1 who can use this gun all the time are Simple, Kenny Airsguard, the absolute best AWPers to ever grace the game, it suggests the opposite. That it's actually a fairly weakened and limited gun, and that it's only used in a tactical manner at the moment. Well, what's funny is at the moment, every single team that we've even talked about so far is like struggling with the primary AWPer. Like, how do we recruit a better AWPer? Oh, there's only a shortlist of like 5 people in the whole fucking world who actually can do that job. So it's funny how every team's struggling with that problem, and it seems like no one's come up with any solutions so far.
The thing is, it's quite difficult to manage pulling off a no-op style. So, like I said, when North...
No, who said no-op style, though?
No. So, like, Team Liquid...
So no primary AWPer, you mean?
Yeah. So, but, like, Team Liquid uses a style where they kind of, like, float it around because they have every player can use it pretty well. I think that's fine, actually. I think that removing JDM, who was mediocre at best, and adding a player who was much more skilled than he was in NAF, who isn't a primary AWPer, showed that you're kind of right, which is, like, if you can make an upgrade with, with just a rifler who maybe can op a little bit, that's probably going to be more useful than adding a primary opper. But like, it's quite difficult when you have no players that can op. So like Space Soldiers is kind of like that, where they have no one who can op enough to op most of the time, and that has cost them quite a bit in recent times. So, old Fnatic or new Fnatic?
New Fnatic. Oh, true. Guess the Drake.
Yeah. No, old Fnatic. Well, Old Fnatic, yeah, I think they more willingly chose not to use the up too much. Like, I remember an interview that he did. It might have been with you actually, Max. Where
wait a minute, who you suggested the new Fnatic can op? It's a serious question.
Probably.
If anything, aren't they a great example of why you don't have a primary AWPer?
Yeah. Hey, we haven't seen a whole lot of Draken yet, man. Got to have a bit of optimism.
Well, he's got his literal in-game leader from the other team.
Yeah. You know what? I actually we have a conflict here. Like, Max really likes Draken, and I don't like him very much as a player.
Let's say, really likes a strong word. I think he could bring something to Fnatic. I don't know. I have tempered optimism. I have tempered optimism. Sure.
I don't have much optimism for either of the Swedish rosters. I don't think the Swedes know what they're doing. But
no, but like to the AWP point, I think it's very easy for AWPer to define a team style and to define a very large win condition for them into a round. And so I think the allure of having an AWPer, especially one that is like, if we want to go for the Draken point, I think Draken's a great example, where it's like the potential of having this aggressive playmaking AWPer on the map. I think, you know, like you saw it just then. It brings me a tiny bit of optimism when I see it walking into a team, because I feel like it's such a defined win condition for a team to utilize. But I think in reality, maybe the difference between perception is too much.
I think there are a lot of AWPers that could be pretty good if you set up the entire game around them, but you need like the problem with someone like Draken is that when you put him in a position where he isn't the rock star of your team, because he's not good enough for you to be a top team if he's your superstar. Yeah, like he's not good in supportive positions, and there are very few AWPers that can do both, where they can take over games, and that's part of the reason why I talk so much about Woxic and also, but slightly less Yugi, because they're players that can play passive and fill in holes when you need to. Yeah, and well, I don't know I haven't made up my mind about Cirque yet.
Oh no, I'm pretty all in on him.
Okay, well, you can be all in on him. I'm not going to be, but like AWPers like that are quite rare, and I think we're seeing that when your AWPer isn't good enough to play as a superstar but can't play supportively, you're put in a really bad situation, because you're just going to either be mediocre with an AWPer that you're focusing on, or bad with an AWPer who's basically wasted every time he has the AWP because he can't play the positions you're putting him in, and so that can be very problematic. In that sense, Liquid is quite revolutionary, where they realized that JDM was just not worth having in their team. Now, it took them way too long to realize that, but you know, I think that we should see more teams try to add very skilled riflers, elite riflers, instead of having pretty good AWPers. Obviously, that's not exactly like, it's not like you can find a superstar in Sweden, you know, by removing Draken. Maybe Brolin, but you know, he's 16 or 15 or whatever. So, yeah. All
right. Well, Thorin, I actually have a pretty good question for you. Sam did that Thorin's platform video with you, where he talked about the AWPers going to Danish teams, and I think he mentioned Yugi and Mertz going in to replace Cajun B. Now, you sort of give Sam plenty of space in that video, but I think there's a part of you that's just sort of furiously disagreeing in the back of your mind, maybe at some point of that video, just being like, what is this guy talking about? Like, Mertz, really? What do you think about, did you think, like, even then or now, do you think that, I mean, we talked about on this podcast if it was even worthwhile to get rid of Cajun B as an AWPer for however flawed he was, because Mertz had so many problems when he first was introduced in this lineup. He was better at some events and now sort of not as good last two events, has his own problems closing out rounds, and Sam tied into how good his CT side, how that affected North. What do you think about this, the Danish AWPers here? I mean, is it sort of a situation where you're talking about where maybe it's not even worth it to have an AWPer on this team?
Like, the reason why I thought the whole Cajun B topic was actually, I thought a lot of people poorly handled that, is because if I had to speculate on what went on in that team, like, first of all, Cajun B was never a primary AWPer in his career. He only did it in the North squads. Like, that's the only time he embraced that role. And so I got the perception that he was, like, along with MSL, main part of the core of the team, and was like a secondary calling element, because he, to some degree, had done that in some of his past teams. And so I actually get the sense, unfortunately, to tie back into that comment about the support players before, that some of why he opted all the time and in certain spots, always this exact angle, always this place in the team, was actually to give the team a structure and to cover up for some of the weaknesses of other members of the team. So when they had Magus just completely falling apart as an individual player, couldn't live up to the star player billing, you had Config, but who was actually fairly one-dimensional, even if he's very good, and so he had to be able to do everything he wanted to do. Then you had AZ brought into the team as some sort of weird quasi-support player who seems pretty decent but isn't going to give you firepower. It's like I feel like they just, like, so in a mad way, obviously he obliged, but they kind of forced KGB to do a lot of that stuff. I don't think by choice he would ever be doing that particular role, because I think if you've looked in every other team, he picks his spots where it makes sense to AWP. So I actually think he's a perfect example of how flawed perception is around the AWP, because first of all, I think you should divide it analytically. There's a difference between being able to AWP your specific spot as CT on a map. That is very different, and many players can do that. That's why it never made sense when people say stuff like, oh, you know, Carrigan can use the AWP sometimes too. Yeah, on his spot on a certain map on CT. There's a lot of players can do that. It doesn't make you a primary AWPer, though. The point is, the primary AWPer, we're mainly talking about what you do on the T side and how you're set into that structure. Because actually the idea of like someone who just goes and creates CT duels all the time with their AWP, that's actually kind of like a played out concept. You know, it doesn't really happen that much in the modern day. That's like a long time ago when people were just playing Dust 2 or something. So I feel like the big problem in this sense was the notion that they had to upgrade AWPer for AWPer, and that whoever it was had to do Cajun B's role, whatever people imagine that was, but better. Whereas actually when I looked at Cajun B, again, I didn't see flaws in him beyond the fact he was forced to primary AWP. What I saw was every problem that came from him being the primary AWPer just was a symptom of a bigger problem within the North team, like lack of firepower, only one superstar player, a core that can only do those roles and cannot do another role, therefore this guy must do it. Because if you looked, I always said he, for me, was like the watermark of the high water point of where superstar AWPers take over and where you just have people who could be a primary AWPer. Because I thought against everyone that wasn't a superstar AWPer, he did fine. It wasn't ever his fault they wasn't losing the game. But obviously he was never going to be able to do that spot over and over and over again against the best AWPers in the world. But then again, who is? That's why I say it's one of those scenarios where, like, if you're going to criticize, you have to have a solution. You can't just say this is bad and then go, what's the solution? Oh, there isn't one. You know, that doesn't really work in that sense. So the Mertz one was a gamble. I think I don't blame Sam entirely because he hadn't really played at any sort of a level where you could know if he'd do well at tier 1. But I definitely was very skeptical because I mean, I think people are fully aware that is literally the one type of player I could define in Counter-Strike that I hate the most, which is primary AWPer, young, fast flick shooting AWPer. Like, I think it's got to be the most overvalued position in practically any team sport I can think of. Like, they're so whack, those players, and yet they constantly get positions in teams. I don't know how they do it, but you'll love them. You'll love them frag movies. So yeah. Over to you, frag movie exactly. Lover number 1.
So I actually think
Sam answers without any hesitation.
He knows.
Dust keeps bugging me about Mertz because he thought that I hyped him a lot, but I didn't get the impression when we recorded that show that I thought that Mertz was very good. I praised.
Well, to be fair, luckily for you, Mertz just like a sort of he's your Morton Bailey, because when you find out that Mertz fails, you'll just retreat back into the Yogi castle, and since he doesn't actually play in a team and go to lands, you'll never have to be proven wrong. So
well, yeah. So
continue the Morton Bailey.
Yeah. So if Yugi doesn't turn out well, I'll definitely be wrong about that. But with Mertz, I thought that it was, you know, worth a shot because he was so different from Cajun B. But I was also very skeptical that he would be able to be a very good player because he wasn't. I don't get the sense from Mertz that he's very mechanically versatile or mechanically skilled. I think he's pretty mechanically skilled, and he has a lot of testicular fortitude. So when he goes up against very bad teams or tier 4 teams or tier 5 teams, he catches them off guard and can punish mistakes. But really, I thought that what really North needed was a better rifler. But the thing is that didn't seem to be available at the time. Like, I would love to replace AZ with a player that's much more skilled than he is, but that doesn't seem to be available. Like, now you could say, oh, well, Config, but like Config is gone. So, and Magus, they refused to play with either of those players, so they kind of screwed themselves out of that. Now, if you had looked at the time, and if I had thought that Kirby would be available, and you know they had replaced AZ with Kirby instead of removing Cajun B from Mertz, that would have made a lot more sense. That would have been a much more solid move, and they would have been a much better team now. But actually, retrospectively, looking at the few tournaments that we've seen Optic in, the right move for them would have been to add in Mertz or add in Yugi and kick AZ and put Cajun B into the rifle role, because obviously, like I totally underestimated him. Cajun B has been very good on the rifle since he's picked it up. He's actually been one of Optic's best players. Like, he's been almost as good as Config has been recently. So props to him. Like, but like the thing is that when you looked at the Danish scene at the time, and somewhat still now, and you're looking at the options that North had, the clearest upgrade was at the op position, not at the rifle position, because you looked at Esatag or you looked at Nico back in Heroic at the time, and those players at least didn't sell me on their potential as top players. And so I looked at Yugi and I was like, oh, well, that seems like a player who can do what Cajun B can do, and he can provide more than he can on the AWP. And I looked at Merson saying, well, you know, he's on their academy team. He might be good, but probably not. And he delivered exactly on everyone's expectations, except for the people who thought he would be like, you know, the best player or whatever, because he was very good at finding opening frags and he was pretty poor at everything else. So I think that, but the point is that I think North are in a bind when it comes to their roster situation, because they need, in order to be very good, it feels like they need someone who's like a game breaker. And it doesn't seem like they have either the financial capital or the players available to actually fill that spot. And they had a chance, I guess, of finding that with Mertz, and they didn't. So now they're replacing him. That makes sense. But I think that removing Cajun B at the time is still made sense given the roster situation and their non-willingness to bet on, let's say, Nico or Esatag at the time.
Say, Max, what about your main man at MSL? What do you think about this? Your boy.
Yeah, this is like the fucking North haters group, isn't it? Why do you all just hate on Cajun B, fucking MSL, but magically they still get the placings though? You must be so confused.
I
still get the placings.
In what sense, Scott? MSL, just in general, just how much I like.
Sorry. My advisor over here, Thorin, with the interruption, telling me. Okay, but Max, what do you think about MSL's choice to go full Parsons to corrupt himself to?
These guys still don't know that reference. Like it's not working. But stick with it anyway.
Bro, I just want to see the reference.
Yeah. All right. Let me get through this question now. Max, what do you think about the roster move? Do you think, what kind of player do you think they need in North right now?
I think I would actually like to. I didn't realize it was the sort of only one event thing. I thought it was the full roster change, Mertz for Mixwell. So I got really excited by the idea of that, because you're talking about, Sam, how Mertz. Well, no, hold on. Hear me out. Hear me out, mate. Hear me out, Sam. Hear me out. I eat this shit up. I love on paper talk. Okay. So like, we're talking about how Yugi can do everything Cajun B could do, but like offer more, right? Yeah. And how it's. And so Mixwell is one of those really, really weird players where I could not figure out his game at all in terms of identifying a specific style or specific strength or like a specific through line of weakness in his game. And I asked a bunch of people and everyone gave me different answers. And so the general consensus I got is like Mixwell just has a lot of talent as a player in like a really sort of broad general term. And then it's just like the utilization of that talent is never as effective as maybe the idea of just how good he is as a player. And so I think in that sense, if like you want to push this idea of Mixwell as maybe a versatile AWPer that can do things but just needs to be utilized effectively, the North seems like a pretty poor option if you want like MSL to use the AWP like well, you know, if that's the famous thing with MSL. But he seems like a better option than Mertz, who is so linear with his strength. I feel like you might be able to get like Mixwell's rifling, I think, is pretty good as well, comparatively to Mertz's. But then at the same time, it's like, is it more so better than what Cajun B could have done? I feel like you're sort of upgrading over a really poor component and maybe not even meeting what you had in Cajun B with Mixwell.
Yeah, well, I actually think that MSL did really well with Mertz. Like, I don't think you can put any of Mertz's shortcomings on anyone, but Mertz, I think that I was surprised by how willing he was, or how willing the team as a whole was to set him up, let him go loose, make really aggressive plays. And so congrats to Ave and MSL on that. I think they gave him every chance that he deserved.
It's one thing giving him a chance versus like knowing how to like.
No, but I think they set him up very well. I just think that
Yeah.
when he failed, it was in passive situations when he was receiving pressure.
True.
And there's not
Like
much.
on CT side.
Yeah, but that's
Yeah,
that's not within anyone else's control.
Yeah,
It's just
that's
him
fair.
missing shots or not using his movement appropriately.
Yeah, or decision making as well.
Yeah, I don't think that North's current shortcomings are MSL's fault. Really, not on a calling.
Blasphemy on the podcast. No. Right.
Yeah, so like I don't think so. Mixwell will be fine. I mean, they'll probably do as well as they did before, which was okay. They did okay, but I don't think that Mixwell is going to be. I think Mixwell's a player's player because he seems like he's a very thoughtful guy and he's quite smart and he's well spoken. But really, even when Optic was really good, you know, when they beat Astralis and everything, I didn't think that Mixwell. I was never very impressed.
Neither on Optic. Mixwell's especially with Freiburg. Like that was.
Yeah, But I just think that Mixwell is going to be a player that slots in everywhere but nowhere well. Like he wasn't bad on G2, but he didn't change much on G2. And so it's just going to be more of the same on whatever team he comes up on, unless you have a very bad opera. In that sense, he's kind of like I'd say kind of like Alu, you know, where Alu is a good opper, but Alu is not going to change the game for you very often. And Mixwell's kind of like that as well, I think. And, you know, it's fine if North are trying to go through this, you know, teenage self-discovery phase where they discover their body and everything, that's great. Mixwell will help them do that by plugging in different holes and, you know, trying to figure things out with them. But
This metaphor is out of control.
But at the same time, I don't think that you can expect them to have some particularly fantastic placings. In fact, they played 2 matches and they actually lost one of them against this new heroic team that kicked their best player. Or one of their best players in Rubino recently. So I think that, you know, we're already seeing that it's not going to be amazing. It's also like immediately they complained after the first match they won, they complained about the English. So that's also a problem. Like if you've watched
MSL complained about the English, and MSL goes on Twitter and complains about
no. Like many players on the team complained. Like
I
Kirby did too.
I only follow MSL. I gotta keep up with him.
But like if you've watched Roar, their show, like they talk entirely in Danish all the time, even though they speak well in English, their clique and their social interactions are all in Danish, and so it would be very strange if they decide to full on go 4 players from Denmark and 1 player from Spain, because it means that you need to shift even your social interactions to include someone, and that seems like a lot to ask out of an entire organization. You know, that's quite a lot to ask just for this
flaw
one player.
Most of those players tend to make, from my experience, is they think because, like, on the surface it's just a language change that's the problem, it's nearly always cultural. Like, half the problem there is in teams like North, where you keep the same core for a long time, you're like sort of phrase book of things you've built up. Imagine like as each phrase is like a macro that refers to a concept that we've already gone over 6 months ago when we figured out this on train or something. Like, half the things they're saying, it's not like, I'm sure translated it's probably the same thing. It just doesn't mean the same thing to that player. He hasn't played in a Danish team, he hasn't played in your team, he doesn't necessarily know what 7 things that's supposed to trigger in his brain. So I think unfortunately it's actually the flaw of having a team that's pretty well run.
Yeah, and we saw that with G2 as well, where they were like, oh, he speaks French and all that, and after like 2 weeks, they're like, he doesn't, it's not working in French as well as we thought it would, and 2 months later, they say, we're still trying to figure out the French, and it's hard. Like, even though you speak a language, you're not like, even me, I'm a French speaker, and if I tried to play in one of those teams, I would not understand a thing they're saying if they're speaking very fast in the middle of a game. Like, French people are very difficult to understand, and so in that sense, I totally think that it would be a very poor choice both for Mixwell, or maybe he has no options, so fuck him. But it would be a very poor choice for North if they decided to keep him. But since it doesn't look like that's their plan, unless they have no other options, I think it's fine for them to use him for Valencia and whatever other tournament is coming up.
All right, Thorin, at the beginning of this little segment on North, you sort of mentioned a sort of role issue with North more generally, not just one-AWPers. Like, did you have a different sort of take on it? With not just talking about like Mertz or who's a better AWPer than Mertz, but do you think they're more broadly that is it like an AZ thing? Is it the way they're using Valde, or did you have a different take on it?
I think it's just a bit of a mess of a lineup. Like at this point in time, they're another one of those teams where it's a shame I've like referenced this video that doesn't actually exist for so long, where I'll do a video on like why teams have like roughly a 6 to 9 month lifespan in terms of how long you're going to be good, and then like, you know, 3 months in max, you should have already hit your stride and have everything in place, you know, because I think if you look again, it's another one of those teams that has failed that timeline in terms of making it through completely. So to me, I don't know why anyone's still like analyzing them now like there's going to be change. Sure, roster move could definitely change some aspects. Even then though, you're not really changing the key elements of the roster for me that much. Like I don't really know what changing Mutz around is going to do for the fact that Kirby doesn't really play like a star player when he plays against tier 1. I don't really know how it's going to fix, like for example, that even with Mertz in the lineup, an admittedly flawed player that even they've now acknowledged, they still did have a fairly like wide map pool. They just didn't have many maps they're actually good on. Like they could play all the maps and they could somehow make that work, but then what map were they actually anywhere close to the best in the world? And it's actually almost that's why what's hilarious is I actually think the only thing you can look at this team over the last 6 months and say it was done well was probably the T-side calling. It actually looks like MSL did a fucking pretty bang-up job with fairly limited tools by routinely having some pretty good T-sides, winning a bunch of games off it, and winning on maps that actually, to be fair, they're worse than the opponent on, and they're worse than whatever the world ranking would be. So they're actually I think they've overachieved over the last few months. I think most of these results are in spite of the players they have. So I think if I were them, I'd scrap the whole team. I think they literally have to just tear that whole core apart and build up from the beginning. And I have to say, one thing I think's a shame is that Optic team has just wasted everyone's time and just only competed at these dog shit tier 2 tournaments because Snappy was supposed to be the control group for MSL. Everyone who thinks MSL sucks was supposed to see Snappy get all these players who, on paper, everyone right now would take the fucking Optic roster over the North roster. But you know what? The Optic roster is not outperforming and don't look like they show any signs of doing so. If anything, they're at best both stuck in the same spot. And actually, if you want to talk about getting the most out of the team, you'd have to give the edge to the fucking North roster at the moment. So I think it's just a bad situation all around. And I'm not really sure how they got themselves in that spot. You could definitely make some criticisms of like, how did you drop from being a team with all this money, second best Danish team, top 10 team in the world, to then having all your players go to the Optics of the world and go elsewhere? Sure, you could make a very sound case about that. But in terms of the in-game stuff, I actually kind of feel like they didn't do that terrible a job once you know what the lineup's like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
I think
speaking of people who think that you could easily replace MSL, and MSL's the problem, Sam and Max return to defend. Got anything to say?
You want to jump in, Sam, or do you want me to?
Yeah. Sorry, I do have. I actually think that you make a good point there, because I don't know how everyone else feels, but for me, I've had a residual expectation of North back from when they had Magisk and Config, where back then, and the reason that I wrote so much about them then is because I always thought that they could be a team that could actually be in the top 5. But looking at the, let's say, top 5 teams now and their rosters, and looking at North, that's an unreasonable expectation. So like they have only a couple players in there that you could expect to compete, and they have no players that are even close to, you know, Nico or Rain or Fur or Cold or Simple or Device, or, you know, so they're really, in that sense, they're struggling. I think the only criticism you can make of North really is that they decided, we don't know if that this is right or wrong, but they decided to remove Magisk and Config for non-in-game reasons, and that has cost them severely, because now you're looking at those players that are still very good players, but North, when you look at what they need, they desperately need a player like Magisk or a player like Config, and so in that sense they suffer it. But where they are now, I mean, if the ideal situation would be that the Optic and the North rosters kind of combined, and you would add Valde into the other lineup to replace Gade. And whether you keep MSL or Snappy, I don't know. That's difficult to say. But I definitely think that like North have done probably the best that they could. They had a really bad start, but now they probably did the best they could do, and they have done better than Optic, because Optic hasn't even qualified to any of these tournaments. So, like, how can you shit on North for when a team with a better roster has done significantly worse than they have over the same span of time?
Yeah. All right, Max, you wanted to defend your MSL hate, your MSL?
No, I think it's totally the same thing as Sam. Now that, like, it's a really good way to frame it. It's definitely like the expectations of North as a team, that is, because the thing, and especially it's not like the expectations you put on them. I feel like it's you get caught up in the expectations people put on authors in general, just with the names on paper. And so yeah, in my head, that's like why my MSL hatred, maybe less strong now. Maybe turn into like a bit of an apologist. I don't know, like make some fairly rational points going around. That was why I shouldn't hate MSL so much. But it's definitely the idea that, like, in my head, if North's meant to be a top 5 team, then how could you have a player as bad as MSL on the team individually? But it's like, well, obviously not going to be a top 5 team, and definitely within the realm that North are aiming
so wait a
for.
minute. Okay, obvious question that brings up. Yeah. So you're just cool with God B playing in big, and you're cool with who's playing in Navi.
God B, I saw many a game where God B played very well. I think and like,
how did his stats end up like that then? Must have been what did he play some off stage we didn't see to average the numbers out? The numbers can't lie.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think that the win conditions that those players bring to the round is greater than the individual detriment they bring to the team, for sure. And
how especially is that different with MSL then? That's kind of what I'm asking.
No, that's what I'm going back on. That's what I'm saying. It's like, because I'm thinking more so like if North want to be competing at a top 5 level, then I think the individual that's what I'm saying. The expectations are like misguided for when I wrote the piece. Because I think if MSL wants to be this like leader at a top 5 level, then for sure his individual play is so bad that can't happen. But like you mentioned a name like Big, it's not like they're not, well, who knows, but like they're not going to be that type of team. So I think the benefit that he brings to the team is far bigger than that. But yeah, I also think like if we're talking generally about North as well, I think Valde has had moments as well, and I think I'm excited to see what he does after this North roster eventually sort of is scrapped and is rebuilt, if that happens, because I think he's got a lot of potential as a player beyond what we saw, like his strong performances in North does. And yeah, I don't know. MSL's a very interesting player to talk about for a lot of reasons, and also just a bit of a meme now in my head.
Well, I accept your apology. And yeah, thanks for Thorin for doing the episode. I think we hit this topic pretty well.